Welcome to the very latest groundbreaking, over-the-top, exhilarating, can't live without it episode of Disclosure. A relatively new broadcast extravaganza from the good people at the Voice of Prophecy, a long-standing media organization that is now in the home stretch of being on the air for a full century. Now, obviously not me. I haven't been in the broadcast industry for a full century. I'm coming up on 50 years of age myself, so I wasn't around for the beginning of this. And the truth is that the Voice of Prophecy isn't quite a century old. I think we're just coming up on our 90th birthday pretty soon. But in my humble opinion, a 90th birthday does qualify as the home stretch in a century of existence. I mean, how many broadcasts have actually been in continual operation for that long? I mean, that's almost from the very beginning of broadcasting itself. Now, in the beginning, the Voice of Prophecy, sort of the parent organization to the Disclosure broadcast, it was actually broadcasting from a chicken coop in the city of Los Angeles all the way back in 1929 when the program went on KNX radio in Los Angeles. And now, after some ups and downs over almost 9 decades, we are very much alive and well and now habiting the state of Colorado. And as many of you know, that was a move that took place just a few years ago. And I remember when we made the decision to move here to the middle of the country from the West Coast, I actually got some letters in the mail pleading with me to reconsider the move to Colorado because of the awful theater shooting in Aurora, Colorado, just about, 40 or 50 miles south of where I sit right now. And at that point, when I got that letter, the shooting was already a couple of years in the past, and as we all know, unfortunately, there's no such thing as a completely safe space anywhere in America anymore because the whole country seems to be turning into a bit of a shooting gallery. But I think what I found ironic in that letter, saying, oh, don't move to Colorado, they had a shooting there, was that the plea was to stay in the greater Los Angeles area, which I guess, according to the writer, was supposed to be safer than northern Colorado. I'm not sure how that works. I did live in Los Angeles for a long time, and not a bad place to stay. It's got great weather, but they are absolutely not shooting free. I don't think anywhere is anymore. Anyway, I'm digressing a little bit. So far, so good here in Colorado. It has proven to be a fantastic place to live. And no, folks, the Loveland Chamber of Commerce did not pay me to say that. This really is a great place. It's kind of like life was when I was a kid, kind of like getting into a time machine and going back to a gentler and kinder time. And this is a great place for people with young families, and you couldn't ask for a better place to live. So why am I talking about Loveland, Colorado today? It's because our topic, it's not really northern Colorado, but it does kind of factor in because this happens to be the very place where the Voice of Prophecy was actually born. I mean, the broadcast was born in Los Angeles, but this city is the birthplace of our founder, Pastor H.M.S. Richards. And the subject of origins is going to be our topic for today. You know, a little while ago, I was reading this story about a guy by the name of Matthew Roberts. I think it was in a British newspaper. And Matthew Roberts knew his entire lifetime that he was adopted. And like many adopted children, later in life, he became a little bit curious about who his biological parents might be. So he did a little detective work. He went through the usual agencies. He followed the usual paths. And he did manage to find his birth mother. But for some reason, every time he brought up the subject of his father, his birth mother would just shut down. She wouldn't talk about it. She seemed to want to keep the identity of his father a secret. But Matthew turned out to be a persistent man, and eventually she did cave in and she told him. His biological father, and I hope you're ready for this, his biological father proved to be the notorious 1960s cult leader Charles Manson, the guy who sent his followers to go and kill Sharon Tate in Northridge back in 1969. Now, I don't know about you, but finding out that Charlie Manson is your biological father, that you have his DNA residing in every cell of your body, well, I'd have to imagine that that might be a little more than disconcerting, to say the least. And to look in the mirror every morning and start suddenly noticing a family resemblance, that would be pretty tough. In fact, in a newspaper interview I read a few years ago, Matthew Roberts told a reporter that it was kind of like finding out Adolf Hitler is your father. I'm a peaceful person, he said, trapped in the face of a monster. So, folks, let me ask you this. Why would it matter? I mean, just because your biological material, your DNA came from Charlie Manson, that doesn't mean you're going to go off the rails, does it? I mean, it doesn't mean that you're going to turn into a homicidal nutcase. I mean, Charlie Manson wasn't the father who raised you. He wasn't there to impose his twisted values on you. He wasn't there to mold and shape your character. In fact, he wasn't there for your childhood at all. And yet, in spite of that, if I found out the same thing, that Charlie Manson was my dad, I think that might bother me too. Why? Well, it's because we all do have this fascination with where we come from. We all kind of realize that what you're made of is going to influence who you actually become. We all instinctively sense that origins matter. And maybe that's why across every culture, the search for origins is one of humanity's most basic instincts. Every culture I've ever come across seems to have a story about where they come from, and that story is enshrined in the culture, and it's obviously very important. Every human being seems to be fascinated when they root through their family tree, looking at the different people and wondering what it has to do with who they are. And maybe, just maybe, where we come from will tell us something about who we actually are and where we're actually going. So to that extent, I've invited Dr. Timothy Standish to come back on the show today because the subject of origins has actually been his lifetime career, and he is no stranger to disclosure. We've worked together in the past. Dr. Standish, I understand you're waiting by on the phone. Welcome back.
It's a pleasure to be back with you, Shawn.
Had you heard about this guy who found out Charlie Manson was his dad?
You know what? I hadn't, but I keep a sort of mental record myself of people who've made these startling discoveries about their forebears. I know that there was a French gentleman a few years ago who believed that Adolf Hitler actually was his father.
Oh, no kidding.
Yes, and then just recently there was a claim that I believe it was King Edward VIII was actually the father of a child in France. I know that he did father illegitimate children, so this apparently was not the first one. But anyway, that was a kind of an interesting observation. And so when you compare the two, I don't know which I would rather find out was my father, Adolf Hitler, or Edward VIII, but there you go.
Oh, my goodness. I don't know how you would go about proving that. I know that for years the Russians have claimed that they have the skull of Adolf Hitler hidden away in a vault somewhere, that they retrieved it from the bunker, but recent DNA testing has proven that the skull they have is female, is what I'd heard, so maybe they don't have it either. I don't know how
that would limit things or explain an awful lot.
Or explain an awful
lot.
Doctor...
Well, you can use genetic testing to eliminate possibilities, at least, when it comes to the remains of human beings. So who knows? Maybe somebody will do a genetic test.
You know, I've gone digging into my own family history, you know, the usual avenues that people take, Ancestry.com and others, and I started to piece it together, and I've gotten back until about the middle 1700s, late 1700s, and it doesn't go much further back than that because my ancestors didn't have last names the way I understand it. It's only when Napoleon came through the neighborhood and forced us all to take last names that we actually did that. And as I understand, the entire city took the same last name because they thought it was a joke and it wouldn't stick. And so our family tree, I can't figure it out. But one thing I have determined, while I'm convinced that my ancestors, and you've probably heard this expression, I'm convinced my ancestors did not swing through the trees by their tails, I'm not entirely convinced that they didn't swing from a few trees by their necks, because there are a few people back there that probably weren't favorites for the justice system.
I know that I've gone back and tried to find some of my ancestors through criminal records as well, but the disappointing thing is that apparently if they were criminals, they were smart enough to get away with it.
Oh, well, that's reassuring.
So I have no doubt that there were some criminal types way back in the past, but the best I could find was a document talking about somebody who had been accused of mayhem, which sounds about right. He had thrown straw in the street to protest something or other, and that this charge was brought against him of causing mayhem.
If only
Yeah.
that's what a public demonstration was today. People
Wouldn't
dumping
that be nice?
straw in the streets.
That's-
Now I think you'd be praised for having done just only that. Hey, listen, the reason you're on, you've got a PhD in environmental biology. You are a biologist. I know that you've worked on a brand new documentary with the good folks at Illustra Media called Origin. And we want to come back to that in a moment. But just before we take our first break, I think the last time you were on the program, you had talked about a discovery with jellyfish. And I'm not sure how to put this delicately, but I think we talked about the way that certain jellyfish actually manage to evacuate their bowels. I'm going to put this as politely as I know how. And if I remember correctly, people had thought for years that jellyfish had to use the same opening for entrance and exit. They ate and evacuated with the same opening. And I'm trying to remember the point that you had made with that.
Well, we're not talking about the normal jellyfish that you might find washed up along the beach. This is a special kind of jellyfish-like creature. And yes, there's a whole evolutionary tree, if you want, that is based on the idea that initially organisms only had one hole. They took in their food through that hole and they evacuated their waste through the same hole.
I am so glad that I am a vertebrate mammal. I am just so glad.
Yes.
Yeah.
So according to this theory, your ancestors were the lucky ones who evolved that second opening that is so convenient.
Yes.
For us. And as a consequence of that, there's this whole sort of Darwinian understanding of things as this donut-like, if you want to think of it that way, body plan came to be. So a donut has a hole through the middle,
right,
and a human being has a hole through the middle. So does a dog and a fish, and in fact many other kinds of animals. But then there are some, like normal jellyfish that you would find, or corals, that in fact do not. The problem was that this other kind of jellyfish-like creature was considered to be a remnant of a very ancestral situation that it turned out not to be.
So it in fact was a donut when everyone had held it out as an example of the non-donut.
Yes. And it was simply a matter of observation. People had watched them and simply hadn't really noticed what was going on.
No pun intended, but the jellyfish must be quite relieved.
Exactly. Life is so much better for a jellyfish than we thought it was.
We are coming up against our first break. The new film is Origin, Design, Chance, and the First Life on Earth. I'm with Dr. Timothy Standish. And Dr. Standish, in just a moment, we'll come back, and I want to start asking you some questions about that new documentary. I saw it the other day, and it's astounding. I think everybody needs to get a copy of this. It's from Illustra Media, Origin, Design, Chance, and the First Life on Earth. You are listening to Disclosure. My name is Shawn Boonstra, and my guest today, Dr. Timothy Standish. In just a few moments, we will be back after this special offer from the people at the Voice of Prophecy. You are back with Disclosure. My name is Shawn Boonstra, your host, and during the break, there was a coincidental spot that played. At least, if you're not listening to a later rebroadcast, the spot had to do with our Discover Bible course, and I think it had to do with origins, and that seems to be a coincidence, unless the good people in the control booth lined it up that way. But Dr. Standish, I will note that in that spot, I don't know if you could hear it on your end, but I pulled a Mr. Haney, which I'm famous for. I managed to make my voice squeak like a 13-year-old boy, and it's a talent I've had since I was 13. Are you still?
Not everybody has it, but if you've got it, you may as well treasure it.
Yes. You remember Mr. Haney from Greenacre? I've been told for years that I sound like him when I let my voice squeak on me. So I may be pushing 50 years of age here pretty soon, but I have still got the voice and mind of an adolescent boy. Dr. Standish, let's talk about the new, I want to talk about the new video in just a few minutes, because I've already had a sneak peek thanks to you and the people at Illustra. I got to see it in advance, and I think it's absolutely phenomenal material. And that's no surprise, because most of what comes from Illustra is phenomenal. And in particular, I remember the Privileged Planet and how useful that was for people to help start understanding, the odds of life appearing on its own. But before we get to the video itself, I want to talk about the issue. Because I know for me, origins are really important, and the older I get, the more I seem to care about where I come from. But you tell me, in your opinion, Dr. Standish, why should we care about how life came into being? I mean, isn't it enough to just accept our present reality and say, well, who cares where I come from? I'm here right now. This is the life I live, so let's leave it at that. Why should I care?
Well, there are certain universal questions I think that everybody has in the back of their mind. Where did I come from? Why am I here? Where am I going? Is there a God? Am I it? Does reality exist at all? These are the big metaphysical questions that our minds seem to be programmed in a way to ask. And the question of origins is the foundation that everything else is built off. If we are, in fact, works of art, we're products of design in some way, we're going to view all of reality, including ourselves, in a profoundly different way than if we believe that we're just products of the sort of uncaring laws of nature and chance. And that's really the question that this film, Origin, Design, Chance, and the First Life on Earth, deals with. We struggle with it. We look at it. We ask the question, what really are the odds? And this is a surprisingly complicated question, but to come up with a realistic answer may not be truly possible. But what we present is some of the evidence and how this question can be approached in a way that is truly informative. And, by the way, can be informed by the science that we actually know. For the majority of people, this question is answered not by science, but by some kind of philosophical presupposition.
Sure.
A materialistic Darwinist or an atheist may answer this. And by the way, those two things are not necessarily exactly the same thing, but somebody who is a materialist or operating within a materialistic framework, they believe that the material world is everything. There is nothing other than atoms and energy, or really you could argue that atoms themselves are energy. And so they restrict their answers to the possibilities that exist within that philosophical reality.
You mentioned philosophy, and
Yes.
And I don't know that it's, I can't believe it's a coincidence that the nihilistic philosophers of the 19th century sort of rose at the same time that Darwinism started to take root in academic thinking. And I don't know if one fed the other or not, but I've often suspected, you get Nietzsche, who's wondering if God is not dead, and then he bemoans the fact that if there is no God, then basically civilization has become untethered, and he made a prediction that the 20th century would be the bloodiest century in the history of humanity. And it's a little uncanny that he turned out to be right. I mean, some of the atrocities that we committed in the 20th century, I've often wondered how much of that was rooted in the idea that we really don't come from anywhere and we are just a materialistic entity that doesn't have a reason for existence. Suddenly, it seems to me, it seems much easier to start eliminating classes of people if they don't mean anything.
Exactly. In fact, I think that it's quite reasonable to argue, and the historical evidence certainly supports this, that the two big political experiments that were put into action in the 20th century, that would be fascism and communism, actually both build off the foundation of Darwinism. There's a reason why Adolf Hitler called his book Mein Kampf, my struggle. His philosophy and the Nazi philosophy was all about the idea of a struggle for existence. They simply put that struggle at the level of individuals and possibly nations. So they were eager to put the German people through a struggle that they believed would purify it from the weak would be eliminated and the strong would survive, and that's survival of the fittest. And out the other end would come a genuinely master race that ultimately would rule the world, dominate the world. And on the other hand, you have communism. And
right.
Karl Marx, he wrote quite openly about Darwin's ideas forming the foundation for his Marxist thinking in natural history. Friedrich Engels, we usually think of Marx and Engels as being kind of fathers of communism. When Karl Marx died, in his eulogy essentially over the body of Karl Marx, he talked about how Marx was the equivalent of Charles Darwin when it comes to history. And in the Marxist way of thinking, the struggle, that struggle for survival, that survival of the fittest, is actually at the level of classes, social classes. So
sure.
Management and labor, rich and poor, men and women, young and old. Everybody is in these different classes that are in a perpetual struggle with one another. By the way, that's why the Communist Manifesto begins with these words about all history that's been recorded is actually the history of class struggle. I'm paraphrasing a little bit.
Sure. No, I was a political science major, which is a good, would you like to supersize that degree? I mean, that's about the only skill you've got is asking people if they'd like fries with their burger. Yeah. Other than the fact that you've read all these books, and I couldn't help but notice that it's presented in Darwinistic terms, the Communist Manifesto and some of the other things that these guys published. What I've always found curious is that they still thought there was an unfolding. I mean, evolution is an unfolding. There was a direction to it, that it's always aiming higher and upward, but without a mechanism to drive it, why would anything move forward or upward, especially in terms of social science?
Well, that's probably one of the more reasonable critiques that can be brought for most political ideologies are built on some kind of idea of advance. How are we going to go forward? And it's maybe it's just a human imperative of some kind. We believe in some kind of sometimes people call it progress,
mm-hmm.
and we have a tendency to believe that progress is somehow or other in the right direction.
Right.
There are those who, obviously there are plenty of people who believe we're going in the wrong direction, but I'm talking about political ideologies. How can we keep things going in the right direction? Well, then we have capitalism and we have all of these other ideas that are out there. Now that's capitalism and socialism are dealing more with economic questions, which, of course, political ideologies feed into in one way or another, whether we like it or not. Because political ideologies have to talk about economics.
Sure.
and economic progress is something that probably everybody wants. Nobody wants to see everybody, or the vast majority of people, wallowing in poverty and squalor. Most of us believe somehow or other, deep down inside, that life should get better.
Yeah, and you've got to wonder where that impulse comes from. Let me ask you this. We've got a couple of minutes till our hard break comes up, and so maybe it's not fair to throw the question out there. But we're 150 years into evolutionary thinking as far as popular thinking goes, and Christians find themselves at a loss. They feel painted into a corner in this debate. They feel silenced. But what I do see a lot of is Christians coming out just using their Bible to show, hey, God created everything. This book says so. Is that a wise approach in this day and age?
No, and in fact, I think the most valuable thing about the Bible is that it tells us how people back in ancient times actually dealt with a situation that's very similar to the one that we find ourselves in today. We think of Darwinism as being a new phenomenon, but in fact it isn't. If you go back and look at the ancient Greek philosophers, those who were doing things in a completely unbiblical kind of framework, they were still struggling with questions about where did we come from?
Sure they were.
How did we get here? The Epicureans actually came out with a system that looks incredibly similar to what we call Darwinism today. And these were the people that the apostles, when they went out into the world to spread the gospel, these were the people whom they encountered. How did they encounter them? How did they change the world in their own way? They certainly didn't walk up to people and start quoting the Old Testament. That may have worked with Jews,
sure,
but
which
certainly
is
not with Romans or Scythians or all of these other people whom they would have encountered.
Well, they're playing the theme music. We're about at the halfway point in the program. If you find that the program doesn't continue after the break, you need to come to voiceofprophecy.com to pick up the rest of this discussion with Dr. Timothy Standish. The new film from Illustra is Origin, Design, Chance, and the First Life on Earth. We're talking about human origins. Does it matter? How can you know what you know? Where do you come from? What does that say about your future and your existence? My name is Shawn Boonstra. You're listening to Disclosure. I'm with Dr. Timothy Standish, and we'll be right back after this. And we are back with the most riveting hour in radio. My name is Shawn Boonstra, and you are listening to Disclosure. My guest today, Dr. Timothy Standish of the Geoscience Research Institute in California. And he has just worked on a new project with Illustra Media, a new documentary called Origin, Design, Chance, and the First Life on Earth. Dr. Standish, let me ask you this. What were you hoping to achieve with this presentation? I called it a film, but I guess that belies my age a little bit. There haven't been films now for quite a few decades. But
that's right. It was all filmed in video. Is that,
yeah.
When you say it's filmed in video, is that an oxymoron? I don't know.
I don't know. I had to explain to a group of young people the other day what a film was and how they used to have to haul out an old film projector. And there is one, an 8mm and a 16mm, on display in the Smithsonian. You know you've arrived when the things of your childhood are in the Smithsonian.
Yes. Anyway, your question.
What were you trying to do with this film? Why is this out?
Why did we do it? Well, yeah. I think the number one thing that we seek to do with all of the Illustra Media films is simply to inform people. We want people to be able to make informed judgments about the world in which they live. That's the number one objective. And obviously, we believe that science provides very useful information to inform us about our world. In this particular case, we want people to make an informed judgment about the origin of life on Earth.
That would imply that perhaps people have not received the full spectrum of information available on the topic in the usual channels. Probably not,
because generally speaking, for example, when you look at many of the productions, I don't want to paint with too broad of a brush, but those productions that are made by outfits like National Geographic
Right.
or the BBC, they tend to come at things from a very Darwinian perspective. They simply assume that Darwinism is the explanation, and therefore they explain everything that's observed within the context of that particular philosophy. And what we're trying to do is just encourage people to take a step back. What if you were not already committed to this philosophy?
Sure.
Would you really see reality in the same way?
Sure. So it presupposes that a worldview helps some people at least cherry pick the information, and perhaps it's time to step back. I mean, real science would be stepping back once in a while to be sure that you're not cherry picking to fit a worldview. Wouldn't that be right?
That would probably be correct. Now, I would say that in reality, you probably can't truly step outside of your worldview.
Sure.
But what you can do is be aware of it and ask yourself the question, would I see things differently if I had a different worldview?
Well, let me step outside of my worldview for a minute, and let me assume for a moment that the creator God of the Judeo-Christian Bible doesn't exist. Let me experiment with that thought. I'm just going to, for the sake of argument, I'm going to say I don't believe there is a God. So now all I have left is a materialistic explanation for the origin of life in this universe. So let me ask you this. If God did not exist, wouldn't materialism be the best explanation, or does materialism still have some failure points in it?
Well, the problem with materialism is that it fails on its own terms. At least that's been my observation. I think that if you were trying to truly argue for about the origin of matter and the origin of even if you were trying to argue about our ability to observe reality within the materialistic context, you kind of fall to pieces reasonably fast. And I'll give you one of many, many, many possible examples of this. But recently, some others and I have been discussing some of the philosophical papers that have been coming out. There's one that is particularly interesting because it makes the argument that natural selection is only selecting for things that perpetuate our species.
Right. Okay.
And as a consequence of that, when it comes to our senses, we can have, in principle, no confidence at all that what we take in through our senses is actually a representation of reality. One example that's used is when I see a snake.
Sure.
Okay. When you look at a snake, let's say you and I were walking through the countryside and we encountered a rattlesnake. We both perceive a rattlesnake. Both of us, according to this way of thinking, have been endowed with the ability to perceive a rattlesnake. And what natural selection has done is whatever we're seeing there, you might be seeing what I would think was a big purple monster. And I might be seeing something that looks like a snake to me. It doesn't really matter. What matters in terms of natural selection is that we don't go and play with the snake. What matters is that we turn around and run away.
Unlike my stupid great-great-great-great-great-grandpa who heard the rattle and thought it was a toy.
No way.
Yeah.
Oh, dear
No,
me.
I don't know that. There are no snakes in the Netherlands
That's right.
like that.
Are you sure he was your great-great-great-great-grandfather?
No,
Because he may not have made the distance. See, natural selection might have selected against him, and you would never have been born.
No, I think I was referring to your great-great-great-grandfather, come to think of it.
Thankfully, my great-great-grandfather was born in Australia, where they don't have rattlesnakes.
Well, now that explains the number of criminals in your family tree, doesn't it?
That's what you would think, but we can't find them. Everybody's so horribly law-abiding. It's been a great disappointment.
Well, they've been naturally selected. The law-abiding ones got out of prison. And let me ask you this. I mean, let's examine the case for a naturalistic, materialistic origin for life. Let me ask you this. What is the best evidence that is put forward that life came into being from non-living matter? What's the best evidence we have that there is no outside intervention and life just spontaneously appeared in this universe? What's the case?
Yeah, different scientists are probably going to give different answers to this. So I'm not claiming to speak for all materialists or
Fair enough.
or anything. But
Fair
for
enough.
me, it is the observation that all living things operate by exactly the same laws of nature that non-living things operate by. So, in other words, your car that you drove, I'm assuming you drove to your studio this morning.
Well, most days I actually walk. It's 5 miles, but today I drove. I got up at 4 and went for a long 5-mile walk and then drove in. So yes, I drove.
Well, you're a better man than me. Anyway, the car that you drive in operates by exactly the same laws of physics and chemistry and so on
Sure.
as your body. And so it may not be a purely logical leap to say, aha, therefore the laws of nature account in some way for your origin. But we do see that invariably nature operates by laws, including those within our bodies. We don't observe too many miracles. That's the reason why people get excited about miracles. There is a consistency to the world in which we live. We don't see God coming down and doing a little miracle every time a baby is born, even though a baby being born, we sort of naturally have this kind of, reaction to it. It is a miracle in its own way, but I think that you get the point that I'm making.
Yes.
So to me, that fact that we operate by invariable laws that do not change, and if we violate them, if we think that somehow or other we have the ability to fly and leap off a tall building, we'll discover that we're not Superman. There's no magic. And we will accelerate into the ground in such a way that the forces that hold our body together overcome, and we will die.
Right.
So that to me is probably the most convincing thing, or the most powerful argument that you can make.
Well, let's go back to Charles Darwin for a minute. He suggested that the first living cells may have been made in I believe the phrase, a warm little pond that had all the chemicals that living things are made of. We might call it the primordial muck. That's what I hear people calling it. What do we know today that Darwin didn't know when he said that kind of thing? What do we know today that would make you doubt that kind of thinking?
There are many things that we know today, obviously, that Charles Darwin didn't have a hope with. Interestingly enough, by the way, I was just in Iceland last month. There are lots of warm little ponds there. And you can stand and you can observe them. You do not see new life popping out of those ponds. In fact, certainly they're very hostile to life. I didn't jump into one because I would be cooked.
Right. Oh, those are hot ponds. I've seen those.
Yes. Now there are, in fact, some bacteria that can live in some warm little ponds. But in general, we can view them as being hostile to life. Warm heat doesn't necessarily help things along very much. But here's one fundamental problem that I see. Living things, all living things, are made out of a relatively small number of quite large molecules. Now, most of what we're made out of is actually water.
Right.
By weight, if we dehydrated ourselves, we could probably lose over 50% of our weight right there.
You could probably sell that in this day and age. The dehydration,
yes,
the
exactly.
dehydration diet.
The water-free diet. Trust me, you'll lose weight and you'll lose your life quite fast. But in any case, when you look at the other molecules, these would be things like proteins,
right,
carbohydrates, lipids, the triglycerides and so on that you find in cell walls, those types of things, DNA and RNA, the nucleic acids, all of these molecules, the major ones that living things are made out of, are formed by a kind of chemical reaction called a condensation reaction. These involve the removal of a water molecule. So you put the two molecules together, and by removing a water molecule, a hydrogen from one and an OH from another one, from the other one, they join together in these condensation reactions. Here's the problem. When you're doing that in water itself, water is not likely to leave those two molecules so that they can join together. In fact, precisely the opposite is likely to happen, and that is that the water molecule will insert itself between these two molecules that, if they're already joined together, and they will break apart.
So it's actually hostile. The water environment would be hostile to what Darwin might have been suggesting could happen.
Exactly. It's what Darwin was suggesting was exactly the opposite of what we study today in high school chemistry. These would not be spontaneous reactions. They would be the opposite of spontaneous reactions. Now, people have suggested complex ways of getting around that problem.
Okay, let's push the pause button on that. I'm going to come right back to that in just a moment, Dr. Standish. The new film, video, DVD, production from Illustra Media is Origin, Design, Chance, and the First Life on Earth. My guest today on Disclosure is Dr. Timothy Standish of the Geoscience Research Institute. My name is Shawn. We're talking about the origin of life, one of the great questions that human beings have struggled with for centuries. Right after this break, I'll be right back. We are back. We have rounded third base. We're headed for home plate. My guest today is Dr. Timothy Standish. And Dr. Standish, right before the break, I stepped on you. I cut you off as you were about to sum up this idea that water was actually hostile to Darwin's concept that living cells may have been formed in a warm little pond. And I didn't let you finish your thought because the people in the control room were waving at me and telling me to take it to the break.
That's right. They were probably slashing at their throat and sort of making twirling notes or gestures with their fingers or something.
Well,
I've experienced it myself.
Yeah, it's okay. We're going to have a Darwinian experiment in the control room, and we're only going to keep two of the three that are in there, the survival of the fittest. I think that's...
There we go.
Yeah.
Anyway, yes, the bottom line is this. Water breaks apart the molecules that we're made out of.
Right.
It doesn't. And in a watery environment, they're not going to be spontaneously forming proteins and so on. So there have been a number of mechanisms that have sort of been added to the mix to try to be able to generate these long, big molecules like proteins. They get progressively more and more and more like the sort of thing that only chemists do in their laboratories using all of their brilliance and equipment. And so that to me is a major problem with these scenarios. Within our own bodies and the bodies of every other living thing, we have special machinery, little tiny molecular machines,
right,
that actually use energy and their mechanical bits and pieces to join these molecules together. It takes energy to do it. And it's a good thing, by the way. You wouldn't want proteins spontaneously forming in your body, because proteins, while they're an excellent raw material for a material for making molecular machines and other parts of living things out of, can also kill you.
Sure.
As anybody who's been bitten by a rattlesnake will know. Those toxins are primarily proteins and stuff in there.
Well, listen, you mentioned laboratories and you mentioned proteins and things. And so the thing that comes to my mind right away, because, on my shelf in my home study, I still have my first year biology textbook. And in an honored place in that textbook, I mean, it's going on 30 years ago that I got the book, but there was the story of Stanley Miller in 1953 who managed to generate proteins in a test tube out of nothing at all, correct?
Yes, the famous Miller-Urey experiment, it's commonly called.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So tell me about that. Why is that still in my textbook? Is it still good science?
Well, basically, it was a good science experiment. What happened was that Miller and Urey, they took what they knew about chemistry, and they filtered that through this Darwinian view of things. They said, all right, we know how these reduced organic molecules, like amino acids that are the building blocks of proteins, we know what they are, and we know the chemical conditions that are necessary to make them. And then they built a machine that replicated those conditions, and then they showed that, in fact, under those conditions, they could actually make some amino acids, among other things, a lot of other things. And that was considered to be very exciting evidence that outside of living things under natural, realistic conditions, you could, in fact, make at least the building blocks of life,
so
the amino acids at least.
Where does it fall apart?
Well, number one, the conditions that they use, there is no really good evidence that those conditions ever existed on Earth. And in fact, good reason, extraordinarily good reason to believe that they actually never existed and could never have existed. For example, in their experiment, there was no oxygen in the atmosphere within this machine. The idea that there was no oxygen in the atmosphere of the Earth is incredible.
Sure.
If you've got water and you have energy, we all know that water is made out of H2O, right?
And the energy will separate those molecules.
Precisely, so that we can actually get elemental oxygen. That's the O in water. But it's not just the water. The crust of the Earth itself, a large percentage of it is oxygen. It's things like silicon, oxides of silicon, or oxides of aluminum, or other oxides. That's the rocks that make up the crust of the Earth. And they also are capable of releasing at least some of that oxygen into an atmosphere. So the idea that there was no oxygen is, it just doesn't seem like a reasonable assumption.
Well, the other thing that occurs to me is that a few amino acids in a test tube do not amount to the generation of life. It's a huge step. I think in the new presentation, in Origin from Illustra Media, you guys have this fantastic illustration that really brings home the odds against anything, sort of combining, even under ideal conditions.
Yes, the amoeba crossing the universe.
Right, 90 billion light years going a foot a year. Wasn't that the illustration?
Yes, that's an illustration that we used in there. Well, what we said was this: let's assume that somehow or other we have the amino acids that we need to form a protein.
Sure.
And if we had those amino acids, and let's assume that they're being joined together in some way, in the right way, by the way, because there's more than one way that you can join amino acids together.
Right.
Let's assume all of that. Then what realistically are the odds of forming a protein that actually does something? So you could say what we've done is we've given away the farm already. We've said, all right, we'll go with all of the assumptions that a
right.
typical
so it's ideal
materialistic scenario would allow for. Let's assume that. What kinds of realistic probabilities do we have of producing a single functional protein? And then, of course, having a single functional protein doesn't make a living thing. It actually, in a dead person, there are probably at least quite a few tens of thousands of functional proteins in a dead person.
Right.
And they're not alive. So the idea that forming one functional protein is, that doesn't even come close to solving the problem of the origin of life. One thing that I didn't mention a little earlier was that there are alternative theories now about where the origin of amino acids, particularly on Earth, may be. And one of the sources is potentially meteorites, because they have found some amino acids on meteorites. So the idea is the Earth was being pummeled by meteorites, and they had some amino acids in them. So maybe that solves the problem.
It only kicks the problem down the road, doesn't it?
Yes, it doesn't even come close to the problem, solving the problem. It's the coming up with a reasonable metaphor that even illustrates the problem, or an analogy that illustrates the problem, is, I don't know. I don't believe that you can realistically do it. What you can come up with is sort of ways that illustrate the nature of the problem, and that's what we've tried to do in Origin. That's we've tried to come up with animations that help people to understand what the nature of the problem is, and then to illustrate it in a way that is understandable, both to scientists and non-scientists alike. And by being informed about that problem, then you can start evaluating the various answers to it that are being offered.
In my opinion, I think everybody needs to see Origin from Illustra. They need to see it just for the amoeba on the bridge. I even dreamed about the amoeba on the bridge last night and the little metal claw that dropped him off an atom on his back. I'm not going to give any more than that away, but you do need to see it. It illustrates powerfully the concept that the odds are 1 in 10 to the 164th power. That's what, 10 billion, trillion. It's a huge number. It's inconceivable. Let me ask you this, with just a couple of minutes to go before they're going to cut us off. I want to get personal, and I want to ask, what does this mean for you? And I don't mean, what does this mean to you as Dr. Standish, the scientist, or what does it mean in terms of current research? What does it mean to you as Timothy Standish, the human being?
Probably the number one thing that I find thrilling about this is that it illustrates how special all life is, how incredible, how remarkably made living things are. They don't just happen. They are a product of, I believe, God. God thought about these amazing things, ourselves and the animals around us. I have 2 dogs. They're so beautiful. God thought of those. God thought through all of the things that are necessary for producing a human being, or a dog, or an oak tree, or an amoeba. All of those things God thought through. And then he didn't just think about it. He actually made them. I love art. An unusual scientist in that respect. and I love to go out and look at these beautiful things, because it makes me marvel about the skill and the brains that these artists have. And yet when we look at the world around us and we understand that this is a product of a brilliant, an incomprehensibly brilliant artist and engineer, and this is the God, obviously, that we as Christians worship, it gives me such an appreciation for the world in which I find myself right now, and of course, hope for the future.
Absolutely.
That God, in fact, does care about us, that he has made provision for us, so that in the future we don't just face oblivion, we face an eternity with him, and that's a wonderful thing.
It's evidence of not just a smart mind, but a beautiful mind. And we are up at the end of the program. I've been talking to Dr. Timothy Standish. The new presentation, the new documentary from Illustra Media is Origin, Design, Chance, and the First Life on Earth. I imagine Dr. Standish, you can find that at illustramedia.com.
Yes.
Illustramedia.com, and you want to get your hands on this because you owe it to yourself to at least ask the right questions. No matter what your perspective, you at least want to be certain that you've asked all the right questions. Thank you so much, Dr. Standish, for joining us this week. This has been Disclosure, a presentation from the Voice of Prophecy. You can find us at voiceofprophecy.com, where you can listen to other episodes, and I'll be right back next time on Disclosure.